Hello everybody, Ben Garris here, and welcome back to ESAS. Let me know if my microphone sounds good. I upped the volume on it just because the video volume was way higher than my mic volume, so let me know if it's a little too loud or what have you. Yeah, so we're starting early today because I want to get through this video. I'm tired of watching it. I just want to get through it and move on with my life, you know. I got other videos I want to watch. I want to bring my friends back, or my one friend back, the one friend that actually watches things with me. I want to go back to watching videos again. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, so quick little update on things currently going on with the channel. Just released the next part of the Skyrim commentary and analysis on the companions. It's extremely short, mainly because the companions questline is rather simple. But I hope you guys check that out and enjoy yourselves with that for a little bit. Next one's going to be Dark Brotherhood, so that's going to be very meaty. It's going to be a lot to talk about there because there's a lot of different aspects of that questline that are a bit deeper than, you know, the companions. But that's for another video. But yeah, we're planning to continue with that on the main channel, and I'm still doing gaming stuff on the gaming channel. I've pre-recorded basically all the way up to August on the gaming channel, so a lot of things are pre-recorded, so I'm probably going to make references to things that are not very current. But that's a problem for future me to deal with. But yeah, so let's just get right back into it, and let's see where we're going next. We're going to the Thumaru Chalice dungeon for some reason. I'm not quite sure why that one specifically, but okay. Let's just see what Acer has to say, and good lord, let's hope we can get through this video, because we're just over halfway, and I would like to, you know, watch another video, but I also don't want to break this up. So here we are.
Now that I'm able to access the final area in the game, I'm going to go back to do all of the optional stuff, starting with the Chalice dungeons. I know for myself that I've spent many hours in the Chalice dungeons, but these are among those elements of the game which really suffered as the development went on. Their original pitch had them be tombs underneath Yharnam City itself, which players could prospect, and upon doing that, would uncover the truth that humans and Thumerians are the same. That is still their function, but I think locating their entrance in the Hunter's Dream causes a bit of a disconnect. The Chalice dungeons are a sort of dream memory, which is how we are able to fight enemies which are long since dead. That reasoning makes it smart to have these things in the Hunter's Dream, since these aren't actual tangible places anymore, but functionally, it separates the dungeons from Yharnam geographically and makes it a bit harder than it should be for people to connect what the narrative ramifications of these things are. They are completely optional, so it's not as if you couldn't skip them anyway, but much like the Hunter's Nightmare DLC, I find these things to be very important to interact with to understand what's going on in this story. As is, players mostly go through the dungeons to get early access to some weapons and to farm blood gems. The dungeon we're currently in first became accessible right after I killed the blood-starved beast, but
well, one thing about the Chalice dungeons, I haven't said anything yet about the dungeons just because I'm waiting for him to make some comments about sort of their overall function in the game and their implementation. But just as a quick aside, I do like the idea of the dungeons, but their implementation feels very, or it's very overly complicated and repetitive and very imbalanced. And that's something that I think should be mentioned is before we go any further with this whole Chalice dungeon stuff. There's the idea of the Chalice dungeons are cool, but the implementation is really, really botched. Like, the difficulty scaling is really haphazard and random. loot's not that great, and sometimes you'll go in there with a set of resources and you will come out with less runes or less blood echoes than you went in, right? Like you don't get enough to warrant going through them sometimes, which I find to be incredibly underwhelming. You know, if you go through a dungeon, kill the boss, and then at the end of it, you end up getting like 5,000, blood echoes. I keep wanting to say runes, but those are kind of my points on the Chalice dungeons as a whole. But we'll see what he says about it, and if he brings up anything specific, I will talk about it. But I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way as sort of a blanket statement on Chalice dungeons. Good idea, poorly implemented.
But since it's optional, I decided to hold back from doing it up until now. Throughout my time playing Bloodborne, I have spent an inordinate amount of time in the Chalice dungeons. There was a time shortly after the game released where my life basically revolved around going to school and then coming back to knock some of these out. And having played them for such a long time, I've come to think that the Chalice dungeons embody the best and worst aspects of Bloodborne in many ways.
Okay, now this is where he starts to make a substantive point, because the best and the worst of Bloodborne, I think, is a statement that you can really dive into in terms of what he's about to say, which I don't know what he's going to say, but this should be getting into something meaty that we can talk about, which I'm looking forward to.
The best is obviously seen in the strength of the core gameplay. Earlier, I said that the basic map for progression in this game was to navigate an area and fight its eventual boss. That's the layout in the dungeons as well, but it's much blunter than it is in any level in the game. The dungeons are impressive on a technical level, as the game has the know-how of how to rearrange and assemble the dungeon's many chunks to manufacture new ones, but
Oh no, let's go back here. You really started talking right as he entered this boss arena.
form in many ways. The best is obviously seen in the strength of the core gameplay.
So in other words, a part of the game that features the basic functions of the game shows the best aspects of those basic functions of the game. That's basically what he's saying, which is basically saying, hey, every area of Dark Souls 1 is fantastic because it shows how useful the different builds are, because you could take different builds throughout every area in Dark Souls 1. It's the point I'm making here is that it's kind of a vapid point to make in this specific section, just because you're talking about a system that is throughout the entirety of the game. So why are you bringing it up here, acting like the dungeons are the ones that show you it? It feels like a false positive that he's attributing to this to counterbalance some of the negatives that I think he's going to bring up with this. But we'll see what he has to say about that if he actually does get to negatives. I thought he was going to have a lot to say about ROM, and then he just skirted over the negative aspects of ROM. So we'll see we'll see if he actually brings up anything negative about these dungeons that's actually like mechanically relevant, and not just you can get lost in them or the bosses get repetitive,
Earlier, I said that the basic map for progression in this game was to navigate an area and fight its eventual boss. That's the layout in the dungeons as well, but it's much blunter than it is in any level in the game.
I would ask what he means by blunter, because the way I would describe the chalices in terms of how they relate to the overworld is that the chalices are just a condensed form of Bloodborne, right? You're in tight spaces with a couple of enemies, then you reach a boss, right? You've got a small area that leads to one boss, and then you kind of repeat that as you go through the area, and you find loot. It's basically a microcosm of Bloodborne that you can refresh and get new enemy placements, new variations in terms of the orchestration of the levels, and you get randomized bosses within them. Now, the bosses do get repetitive at times after a while, just because eventually you fight all the basic variations. But it is a weird thing that these things are sort of a scrunched down version of Bloodborne, basically.
Dungeons are impressive on a technical level, as the game has the know-how of how to rearrange and assemble the dungeon's many chunks to manufacture new ones. But compared to what we see in the rest of the game, the level design is pretty pathetic.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. When you see what From Software can do, the Chalice dungeons are very mediocre. I need to grab that Immortan Joe clip from Mad Max Fury Road, because that's a really good clip to use whenever you want to insult something. It's just his masked face going mediocre. I need to clip that and use that.
Might impress on an initial visit, but once you've gone through the areas a few times,
You'll see just how much the dungeons are recycling themselves. Computers are not quite at the level where they can compete with artisan level designers, but even then, I still think the Chalice dungeons feel good to play, which goes back to what I said about them showcasing the strength of the core combat.
Again, that's such a false positive to attribute to the dungeons, right? It's not like you're basically saying by going through the dungeons, you get to play the game more, because the combat is the majority of the thing that you're going to do in the game, right? It's not any substantive, like there's no substantive point there that relates to the dungeons specifically. It's just you get to do more Bloodborne shit in the dungeons. That's it. It's not a really meaty point talking about how the dungeons might change things up combat-wise or whatever, right? There's no real point behind that beyond you basically get to play Bloodborne as you play Bloodborne in an area that's recycled and rejuvenated every little bit.
I can't go through more than one of these at a time anymore, since I'm very burnt out on having played them as much as I have, but that I've spent as much time with them as I have says something about the strength of the core gameplay.
Oh man, it's that. I want to go back and get that full quote for a second, just because it brings up an interesting point.
Combat. I can't go through more than one of these at a time anymore, since I'm very burnt out on having played them as much as I have, but that I've spent as much time with them as I have says something about the strength of the core gameplay.
He's burnt out, but the fact that he did it so often to burn himself out shows the strength of the core gameplay. And that's one thing that I kind of agree with, is that I think the core gameplay of these games pretty consistently is engaging, but that's just because of the style, right? Things are very punishing. Animations can't usually be canceled. And, it's a game that commits to its ideas. Or rather, this is a studio that makes games where you have to commit to what you're doing. There's no take backsies. Like if you're on low health and you use a heavy attack, and while you're attacking, you realize you're going to get hit by an enemy's light attack and that'll kill you. You see that coming, but you can't change anything. You've done the animation, and now you have to, deal with the consequences of doing the wrong move at the wrong time. That's part of the fun of these games, is that it involves sort of an extra predictive strategy to how the combat works. And that's part of the engagement, is because it's difficult, usually fair, and you have to strategize with the different ways that your enemies and the obstacles they present, how they relate to your specific build. I'm talking across all the games, not just Bloodborne here. But that is a core strength of the games, is that the combat is interesting because of those sort of commitments and the punishing nature of it, relative to how things work mechanically in terms of the combat, in terms of trading damage or mitigating damage by doing the appropriate or an appropriate attack to maximize damage and maximize damage dealt and minimize damage taken.
That it can take detours into relatively, comparatively unimpressive levels without killing the experience outright.
Another component of the game we can put under the microscope by looking at its implementation in the Chalice dungeons is the game's approach to storytelling. The dungeons thrive on environmental storytelling more so than anything else, but considering their structure, this might be seen as a missed opportunity. The fixed dungeons, the ones which are actually telling a story relevant to the main game, are called fixed because there is never any change when we connect to them. Every enemy is located the same in every area, and every item is as well. The missed opportunity I'm talking about is that the dungeons don't have any notes spread around. They could have been left by NPCs. Talking NPCs are also a non-feature in the Chalice dungeons, just saying. These could have been left by NPCs to give the player some lore to these areas. I think that something as simple as that, or having the dungeons be entered in Yharnam City, could have gone a long way to help players connect the dungeons mentally to the happenings in the main game. Something I will note about the Chalice.
That is something that I think could have actually been a good implementation, is if you're going to randomize, excuse me, I'm real snotty right now, I apologize. But if you are going to randomize like areas and enemies and bosses in these dungeons, you could also implement a note system that does something similar and drops a little bit of lore about, whatever dungeon you happen to be in, right? Like give some lore about, the blood, where it came from, maybe some notes about the previous civilizations that were down here and exploring shit. Just you can explore that lore in extremely bite-sized things that could make this a little bit deeper than just new area with repeated enemies and randomized layouts. Right? They could have put a little bit more lore in here, but given that, I don't think it's necessary, right? Because these are, the dungeons really are basically just a way to give the player more to do that is somewhat new without having to fully build a new section of the game. And for that, I think Bloodborne had a very unique idea that could have been expanded upon in later games. But sadly, from what I've seen, they haven't expanded upon that at all. Which is a shame. Because the idea of having randomized farming locations with randomized bosses, I think is a good idea if they balance it appropriately. But given that Bloodborne came out in 2015, and from what I understand, the game's released since then, I've played the crap out of Elden Ring. I don't think Sekiro has this, and I didn't play Armored Core 6. But from what I can gather from those 3 games, they did not implement anything like the Chalice Dungeons in those games. So I think it's fair to say that the Chalice Dungeon idea was an experiment that they retracted moving forward. Or not retracted, but like they stopped working on the idea because it clearly didn't work that well, because otherwise it would pop up in other games.
Chalice dungeons is that Bloodborne's usual hesitancy on attaching traps to the enemies so that players can rally goes completely out the window here, since the areas are randomizable. That means pitfalls, arrow shooters, rolling boulders, and guillotines are all standard practice here. More so than being a creative decision or a decision made to have the dungeons congealed with the core gameplay, I think that's the setup, simply because it's easier to have a chunk of level which has a trap in it be accessed and located by the game than it would be for the game to be able to generate ambushes and the like. I said earlier that
that is a good point. Is like it's a lot easier to, or at least I imagine it's a lot easier to, like when you're randomizing something, to simply code in, here is position of walkway. Let's randomize if there's a trap of a boulder rolling down the pathway or the little spiky things hanging from the ceiling swinging across, right? It's probably a lot easier to randomize that than to randomize an enemy that has an ambush function. Because I kind of see where he's coming from with that, which, I think is a thing that can be useful when you're doing this sort of randomized, repeatable dungeon thing. Anyway, let's go back.
To be able to generate ambushes and the like. I said earlier that players don't like grinding as much as they do progressing, so if an area is giving them trouble, they'll probably retry it rather than retry an old one to beef themselves up for future encounters. That being said, the chalice dungeons are a great way for the player to take a break from the main game and just grind out some levels. Alternatively, if
Now, let me back that up.
That being said, the chalice dungeons are a great way for the player to take a break from the main game and just grind out some levels.
I would add the caveat that sometimes that can be helpful for grinding out levels, mainly because there are some instances where the dungeons will give you so little. I keep wanting to say runes and souls. It's not. It's blood echoes. Sorry, I've played a fuck ton of Dark Souls and Elden Ring, but like, these dungeons can give you a good source of resources and levels, but not consistently. There are going to be times where you're not going to get that much out of a dungeon, and you might actually go in and come out with less resources than when you went in. And that is something to keep in mind. These dungeons are not always going to give you stuff that are advantageous to what you might want to do.
Alternatively, if dungeon crawling isn't your forte, ritual material sells for pretty respectable rates, and a single playthrough of the game usually has a few level ups available in the random ritual material you find strewn around. If you've never interacted much with the chalice dungeons, you might be surprised that there's still a thriving online community around them.
This is one thing that I think does impact the chalice dungeons as well. This is something that's kind of random, but like the online function to some of these dungeons, I think is a bad implementation of online, just in the way it sort of works, as well as needing PlayStation Plus to be able to do certain dungeons, right? I think that's kind of ridiculous, right? And I think that's kind of in a way, you could call it a microtransaction of sorts, where in order to do certain dungeons, you have to be online and you have to have PlayStation Plus to uh, make some dungeons work. Like the famous Cum dungeon, right? That sounds incredibly horrible out of context. But it's a dungeon where you have minuscule health, but you can walk like 2 feet away from the lantern and you get like, what is it, like 70, 80,000 blood echoes from some NPC that gets killed off screen, right? Incredibly popular farming spot. But you have to have PlayStation Plus to activate it, as far as I know. Now, if I'm wrong, let me know, because I'm pretty sure that most dungeons are locked off by having PlayStation Plus. Like, you have to have that in order to interact with a lot of dungeons, which I think is a stupid Sony limitation. And I'm really glad that From Software seems to be stepping away from Sony, because Sony just seems like idiots. The more I read about them, the more I hear about their implementation of shit in the video games that they're attached to. They just seem like total fucking idiots. But that's neither here nor there. Actually, it's everywhere. But anyway, let's get back to this.
Players have mapped them out pretty extensively, so if you want to ever experiment with Bloodborne builds, learning about the best glyph for items, gems, and blood echoes is pretty accessible now.
Let's go back, experience that. I'll make a point in a second.
Pretty extensively, so if you want to ever experiment with Bloodborne builds, learning about the best glyph for items, gems, and blood echoes is pretty accessible now.
If you ever want to experiment with Bloodborne builds, something he said earlier, the game was relatively, freeing on, because you didn't have that many builds to confuse you. Kind of weird how he's talking about builds in a game that largely doesn't have any major difference besides weapon type.
In a sense, the online fan base has sort of created a Tomb Prospector covenant outside of the game. Now, in retrospect, I'm sure that if From Software had all the time and money in the world, they would have found a way for tomb prospecting to be an actual covenant in the game, but as is, fans have really stepped up, and I think the online ecosystem surrounding the Chalice Dungeons is actually the most engaging Bloodborne covenant to interact with, even more so than the actual in-game ones.
I would kind of say that's true in a way, because talking about these dungeons and what you can get out of these dungeons is far more engaging and consistent than going through Covenant shit to either summon people to fight bosses or invade people to get rewards, right? Like the Covenants are usually so tied to the online that if you don't do online stuff, the Covenants ultimately become useless outside of like quest lines that deal with Covenants, right? But like having the community kind of come together to kind of compile information about different dungeons that give you different results and rewards and different items and things is incredibly useful, and that's part of the fun of living in sort of the modern gaming age, where you have the internet connecting all of us that have all different sources of information that can be useful for each other. And that is kind of fun. When you need to look for certain items, you can go to a forum or a wiki and you can look for specific items in specific dungeons and then figure out what you need to craft those dungeons, and then you can make them jump in and grab what you need while playing the game more. It is a cool sort of a symbiotic relationship between the fan and the game at that point, where the fans are informing other fans of new ways to play the game to get what players want in the game to continue playing the game and have fun with the game. So it's a nice sort of loop where you want something, some other player has found a way to get that thing that you want, you communicate somehow to retrieve that information, you make your own thing, and then perhaps along the way you learn something that someone else could use, and then the cycle kind of repeats over and over and over of informing each other. And that is a really cool aspect of the Chalice dungeons overall, is that it's sort of a new experience for each player on an individual basis that creates a total package that the community can sort of pick off of in terms of when they need specific things. And that is one cool thing about the Chalices, or the Chalice dungeons, I should say.
This success story really goes to show how much players can bring to a game. The Chalice dungeons are also, I think, the best places for co-op in the entire game. Once you get a few layers deep, these things can actually become quite extensive and difficult to navigate, and having to work together with a friend introduces a new kind of challenge to the dungeons, which goes a long way to keep it engaging in spite of the repetitive areas. You'll excuse me if I'm repeating myself, but I think all it takes for an old area to become interesting again is the introduction of a new challenge. One which is interesting enough for players to actually have to reassess what the area is. I talked a bit about this in terms of what Covenants can do for the single player, since they could theoretically introduce global challenges which have players reassess their path through the world a bit. And in the Chalice dungeons, there's a lot of little shakeups and optional challenges, which I think helps my argument that Covenants could be one way of varying up the game.
I kind of agree with that in a way. Like having like the same area but different challenges does increase replay value. That's ultimately what you kind of want out of a game, is you want a game that has high replay value, right? That's one reason why Minecraft is such a popular game and why it has been a popular game basically since its inception. Because everything regenerates randomly, you basically get a new experience every time. You get a new map, you get a new distribution of resources, and that's a lot of fun. On top of the crafting mechanics and the building mechanics in Minecraft, right? That's part of the charm of Minecraft, is it's got a really good replay value aspect because of the way the world regenerates in different ways. And other games have that too. Like the Souls series are pretty known for their replay value because of the different builds you can use to go through the game, right? As well as New Game Plus. And all those things factor into replaying the game, which in turn makes the player play the game more, which usually is a good sign of playing a good game. When you want to replay it.
I noted already that Bloodborne decided to not include any of H.P. Lovecraft's monsters and instead went for their own pantheon, but actually that's true for every other horror enemy as well. The Vile Bloods are inspired by vampires, but they have a lot of unique quirks to them and don't really engage like you might imagine vampires doing. There's no garlic, no bats or smoke, no luring or perversion of the innocent. Same thing with the beasts in Yharnam.
They might evoke the imagery of werewolf movies, but they aren't functioning on werewolf logic.
Yeah, this is one thing too. Is like probably part of the reason they can't use like Cthulhu, Lovecraftian stuff too much is because that's probably a copyright issue, right? Like you probably can't just lift Cthulhu, and then just plop it in your game, right? You can make something similar, like with what Bloodborne did, but this is also a thing where they're taking sort of tropes from other classic horror things and then putting their own particular spin on it. Like the beast blood is a good example of taking a twist on the whole idea of the werewolf, right? And it's very apparent in this game that they have taken that idea of a werewolf, of people transforming into beasts, and they've made their own sort of version of it with all the different types of beasts, how it all works in terms of like blood administration being kind of the reason that people start to transform and all this other stuff. Like you take the basic concept of what a werewolf is, and then you create your own sort of mythos and mechanics to make it interesting, right? And like he was talking about with the the Canehurst Vile Bloods, right? They're sort of like vampires, but they're not traditional vampires, right? They're the From Software spin on vampirism and vampires in general, right? And that's part of the charm of Bloodborne, is that it takes a lot of horror aspects and gives the From Software spin on it, which is part of the charm.
Sure, they are a representation of man's struggle against his inner beast, like the werewolf used to be, but functionally, they don't show any weakness to silver, and transformations aren't connected to the lunar cycle. Well, until the red moon hits, but that's a whole can of worms on its own, and I'd actually argue that the red moon is very much its own concept. Similarly, the eye-collecting hacks aren't quite witches, the giant boars seem to come out of nowhere, the Huntman's minions aren't quite Mr. Hyde, you get the idea. If Bloodborne were to ditch the gothic aesthetic but maintain the entire story, I doubt people would even make the connection between, say, Vile Bloods and vampires, because their functions are so drastically different. Going back to our talk on vermin, these things are said to be the root of man's impurity in this game, and they are juxtaposed internally against the phantasms. I said earlier that phantasms are connected to arcane, but more specifically, we might even say that the phantasms are to vermin what great ones are to humans, because the phantasms seem to just be the vermin of the great ones. An eye full of vermin is the eye of a blood-drunk hunter. An eye full of phantasms is the black sky eye. In the Forbidden Woods, we saw humans who were being piloted by the mass of vermin within them, and enemies like the brainsuckers are the exact same phenomena, but they are piloted by the giant slug phantasm in their heads. In the Old Hunters DLC, we saw 2 new build paths introduced with the Milkweed rune and the Beast's Embrace rune, and those specifically are arcane and beast builds. In the Chalice dungeons, this divide is shown in the juxtaposition of Ailing Loran and Ys. One is a sand-devoured hellscape full of beasts, the other is a transcended, almost ethereal plane full of kin. The vermin phantasm divide is an expression of a very big theme in the game, which is stagnation versus transcendence. Willem and Lawrence both wanted to evolve, but Willem stagnates trying to elevate his thoughts, and Lawrence evolves into a beast, so in a sense he devolves. The earliest bosses in the main game are all beasts, but the final ones have an affiliation with the Great Ones, or are Great Ones. Stagnation originates in deep filth. Like I noted earlier with the theme of flow, it's poisoned water which houses maggots, and that becomes stagnant blood which houses vermin. In contrast, phantasms and the Great Ones come from the cosmos, from the dreamlands. If the sky and the cosmos are one, then the Great Ones literally come from above, like rain, like a waterfall, like sunlight, like all of those good forces which are the source of vitality. I could go on listing examples, but the point is, the divide between stagnation and transcendence permeates almost every facet of the game. But the twist is that there doesn't really seem to be a quality difference being made about the vermin and the phantasms. Brainsuckers and snake-infested humans both suck. They are both human corpses which are piloted by something else. I'm jumping ahead into the DLC to talk about this, but the guidance rune might specifically be making the point that beasts and kin are kinda the same thing. I'll go more in depth on this later, but guidance was the rune which Ludwig acquired from the Holy Moonlight Sword. It is constructed from threads of light, and it gave him calm in the middle of hunts, represented in-game with it increasing rallying potential. But the guidance rune might actually just be an incomplete or alternative version of the beast rune. Check it out. So maybe Ludwig just got half of a glimpse of beasthood and it deluded him, or maybe beasthood and celestial guidance are motivated by the same forces. What Ludwig saw might have been the image of celestial guidance, as the rune gives the impression of someone stargazing, but this divide between looking at the sky and becoming a beast is awfully familiar, right? Willem and Lawrence, the choir and Mensis, phantasms and vermin. Ascension, as Birkenworth understood it, might have been a dead end all along, and it seems like Lawrence understood as much before the end, but I'll talk about this some more when we pick up the third chords.
Okay, I guess we're done with dungeons. I thought I'd talk more about the Chalice dungeons and the bosses that they're in, but I guess not.
The next optional area of business will be Upper Cathedral Ward. Upper Cathedral Ward is my favorite area in the game, largely because of the environmental design and the way it marries Yharnam's gothic visuals with the Lovecraftian tentacle stuff. And since this is a From Software game, I suppose a talk on fairness is in order, and this is as good a time as any to place it. To lay the groundwork, I'm going to establish that there's a difference between a game being fair and a game feeling fair, and that for the most part, the Miyazaki-era FromSoft games have done a really respectable job of being fair. But their often obtuse nature and unconventional design ethos can make them feel unfair to players not familiar with them.
And that's something I totally agree with. Like, that is a common thing where people think the game is being unfair when it actually is fair. You just have to pay attention, right? And that's something that, I think a lot of people can miss in the games, is that they feel overly punishing when really it's just a matter of you're not paying enough attention to what's going on.
Everyone listening probably knows the feeling of getting mad at a remote when it doesn't do what you're telling it to. And that sort of anger is often produced by these games as well. It is infuriating when a tool doesn't do what it's meant to, but as anyone in tech support would tell you, all too often it is just that the people operating the tool are using the incorrect mental software for the task. And when the tool doesn't do what they want, they get mad at the tool rather than rethink their approach. If your idea of an action game is one wherein button mashing is enough to get by, then Bloodborne is going to feel unfair because you are operating on the wrong assumptions. Likewise, if you've been conditioned to not worry about death because checkpoints happen every minute or so, again, dying in Bloodborne might feel unfair because you are operating on the wrong mental software.
And this is one thing, is what he says can apply to all the From Software games, sort of after Miyazaki started making, Demon Souls in 2009. But I do want to put that as sort of like a caveat, because he keeps saying Bloodborne when he should say From Software games, right? Because even if he was just talking from this perspective in, I think, 2021 when the video came out, 3 years ago. When was that? 2020? Yeah, 2021. So, like, everything he's saying can apply to all of From Software's games, from like the Miyazaki era, right? I'm a little curious why he's not bringing that up and only doing it for Bloodborne, though. That seems kind of strange to me.
The term "get good" is often used as a mostly fun-spirited insult to players who refuse to engage with these games on their own merit, but mocking or not, it does contain at least this much truth. Most of the time, the screw-ups are the player's fault, and not the game's.
Now, that's not to say that the games are never unfair. I don't think any game can be playtested enough for random unfairness to be completely erased, but as long as you engage with these games on their terms, they are immensely beatable. That said,
I mean, that's also true. It's like these games are extremely difficult because you don't understand. Once you do understand, they're actually not that hard, right? There might be some limitations, and there might be things that you might need to sort of get in place for things to be not that difficult to begin with. But once you understand the games, once you have gotten good, they're not that hard.
games on their terms, they are immensely beatable. That said, there are some carryover motifs which players have been complaining about for a long time, which I have varying degrees of sympathy towards. For one, Bloodborne is all or nothing. You don't get to cancel an attack once you've started it, so if in the last frame before an attack starts, a new piece of visual information presents itself, players will just watch as the hunter screws themselves.
This also applies to the other games. Again, I'm not sure why he's specifically only talking about Bloodborne here. It makes it look a little biased when all you mention is Bloodborne doing it when the other games do it as well.
Additionally, outside of locking mobs out of boss arenas, there's no real attempt made to leash enemies to make them act fair. It would be possible for the game to check how many enemies are aggroed on the player and then only allow, say, the 3 closest to them to actually attack and make the other enemies circle around the player waiting for their opportunity. That way, the game would give the player more of a fighting chance. But From Software does not seem to be interested in doing that. This hard dedication Bloodborne asks of the player's inputs is also emphasized by the copious amounts of autosaving it does. Once you die, the game cannot register it fast enough, so if you try to shut down the game and reload your last save point, you're almost certainly just going to load right into the "you died" message.
Yeah, and this is one thing that, like, in rage moments, I have definitely done that, where I have tried to turn the console off or turn this game or like quit the game so that I don't lose progress that I just would have lost anyway because I died. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think we've all been there as Souls players where it's like you desperately try to quit the game before the bad thing happens. And then when you load back in, the bad thing happened anyway and you're screwed.
Now, I understand
Now you're screwed. You screwed because of your own mistake, not because the game screwed you over most of the time. But that is kind of a funny thing that we all kind of go through is the desperation to try to make things work, even though we know we fucked up.
right into the "you died" message. Now, I understand not liking this approach to game design, but to argue that Bloodborne being more dedicated and more punishing than conventional games is a mark against it, to me seems completely ridiculous, since these games largely got big because they offered players exactly what the AAAs didn't. Challenge. Like it or not, challenge is core to the identity of FromSoft's games, and as someone who's played Dark Souls with mods can attest to, removing it makes the games almost fall apart. If you have access to Dark Souls on a PC, I genuinely recommend installing some easy mods just to see how much the heavy penalties are doing to prop these experiences up. I'm not going to host a talk about the validity of adding difficulty modes in these games, since that's a needlessly toxic conversation.
Needlessly toxic conversation. What are you talking about? We could talk about it. Here's the thing. There is no toxic conversation, right? I want to put that out there right now. There is no such thing as a toxic conversation. When you are berating someone and not allowing them to talk and give their perspective on it, that's when you have a toxic conversation. because it's not a conversation anymore. You know, it's just one person yelling at another person, right? If you want to, like, conversations are important to have, and we should be able to talk about these things, you know, and we should be able to jump into them and rant about them however much we want. You know, especially when you're making a video like this where you're talking about Bloodborne and analyzing things in it. You should be able to rant as much as you fucking want about everything in the game, right? And give off as many opinions as you want and throw out as much information as you feel is necessary, right? You should be able to do exactly what you want. And you should be able to get your point across, you know, through the various means that you have at your disposal, right? But let's back up for a second just to get this whole thing he's saying.
I'm not going to host a talk about the validity of adding difficulty modes in these games, since that's a needlessly toxic conversation for some reason. But I'd like people who are interested in that talk to consider how much of the perceived difficulty is because of the damage values, which can be scaled, and how much is because the player isn't engaging on the game's terms. And then consider that without fundamentally altering these games' identities to conform to convention, the latter cannot be modified without adding a lot of dev time to each release. A similar quibble to the dedicated heavy penalty combat is the heavy penalty which is often attached to exploration. It is possible in these games to get yourself into a dead end with an army of enemies in tow. And what often happens there is that one of the combat system's shortcomings is revealed that, bar some lucky placements, it's unable to handle many mobs well in tight spaces. Under no conventional circumstances can the player utilize the invincibility frames they gain from rolling to clip through an enemy, and so the player will often be destroyed by an army of weak foes simply because enough of them grouped together attacking the player out of sync will lock the player in recovery frames and offer them no chance to begin their own attack.
And this is one thing that is true about the games, is that, like, you can run into issues where you basically get body blocked into a corner and stunned to death. That's one of the biggest criticisms of Dark Souls 2, is that a lot of the enemy encounters are built to do that specific thing to you as the player, which is part of the reason why that game is particularly frustrating compared to the other ones, because it's doing the most annoying version of the combat against you. Now, the pros of a lot of the other games is that for that to happen, the player has to make bad decision after bad decision after bad decision most of the time, right? There are very few encounters where you will deal with more than, let's say, a handful of enemies that you can't easily slap down, right? And this is one thing. Easily slap down basically means that you can't kill with a few swipes, right? A popular example that most people would probably know is the lead up to the Bell Gargoyles in Dark Souls 1, where you go through the upper area of the bell tower thingy, and you've got the group of sort of super weak undead that are buffed by the channeler up there. They are super weak health-wise, but the channeler is what makes it more difficult, and the number of them is what makes it more difficult. Now, they have very light attacks when they're not buffed, and the channeler, can be dealt with if you do it right before he can buff them and make them more damaging. But by the time you fight your way up there, you should have cleared enough space below you where you should be able to handle them, right? Or at the very least, fight a couple of them off, retreat a little bit, kill a couple more, retreat again, right? The better parts of the design in these games are built to give you unique encounters that don't devolve into basically just spamming you where they rape you in a corner, right? That's one reason why Dark Souls 2 is frustrating, is because a lot of the combat does devolve into being raped in the corner where you have no real control over your character because you're getting stuck in recovery animations. Like he said, the trick is that a lot of the encounters in these games are built to avoid that. And a lot of the encounters that you experience outside of Dark Souls 2, in, say, Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, a lot of the encounters where you're going to be raped in the corner by multiple enemies where you're just stunned to death, that will usually, I say usually because sometimes it happens, that will usually be because you triggered too many enemies at once and tried to run through them all, and then you got ganked in the corner because you triggered them all too early, right? Most of the time, it's not the game's fault. It's your fault for pulling too many enemies at once. It's similar to playing a game like World of Warcraft, right? And you pull too many enemies at once when you didn't have to, right? And that's part of the, that's sort of the setup to the complaint where you go, okay, you may have been ganked in the corner, but did all of the enemies spawn where they all attacked you at once, or did you run into them and trigger them to attack you, right? It's that difference between something being unfair versus the player making a really stupid decision.
Again, this sort of frustration seems to come with the territory of being a game players need to dedicate their decisions in. It might feel unfair to be locked out of fighting, but if you had been more tactical, had the foresight to not go running into tight spaces without knowing where they led, those sorts of deaths are almost entirely avoidable. Once the player adapts to the game's terms, most challenges they face will not fall into the category of feeling unfair, but it's interesting to think about how much the role of agency affects the player's sense of fairness.
All right, I have to go do something real quick, but I will be right back. So until then, enjoy this troll song intermission. Okay, sorry about that. I had to check something. But yeah, let's get back into this.
If I died because I hit the wrong button, that's on me. If I died because the enemy locked me out of movement, that's unfair. Such seems to go the conventional argument, at least. Another culprit people often point to in the fairness conversation is the unreliable lock-on, especially as it relates to bosses. Many bosses are able to escape the lock-on by zipping around the area fast enough. The player's axis of movement is locked to the angle the camera points to, and I think that if players actually got to test what it'd be like to have an enemy jump across the arena without the lock-on breaking, they would lower the temperature on this argument a bit.
I mean, that's kind of a fair thing. Like one thing that I've addressed in some videos I've made is certain people's complaints about the camera. For example, a common one is the fight with two examples. One is the fight with Calamite in Dark Souls 1 and the fight with the Nameless King in Dark Souls 3. But it's one of those things where just it kind of depends on what the player wants to do. Like for instance, in the Calamite fight, whenever he does a particular move where he will rush past you, you will usually lose lock on, right? But in which case you can, move your camera pretty quickly. But it is a thing where in the Nameless King fight, I never had a lock on issue. I remained locked on, and it was only in rare instances where he did a extremely fast like shift to position that made me, de-lock on, whatever the correct term for that would be. But I do think there is a criticism for the camera in some of these games sometimes that is warranted, because when the enemy moves around and your whole combat encounter desperately needs you to lock on to the target, that's something that you should try to let the player not have an issue with, right? Because if you affect one of the core aspects of combat in a way that makes the experience more difficult when it doesn't add to the overall experience and instead just makes the controls seem frustrating, that's something that can lead to a lot of problems in terms of designing enemies. Like, now granted, sometimes it's blown out of proportion, like I think it is with the Nameless King, right? Like I've not had that many camera issues with the Nameless King, or any other boss that is fast and moves around, right? But that problem certainly exists and can certainly happen when the boss moves around so quickly and you have to re-find them, after locking onto them, right? Like there should not be any barrier or any problematic camera lock-on issues in a boss fight. It's just a bad idea. It's going to build resentment from the player side toward the developers or toward that specific encounter. And you generally don't want that. You want things to work consistently. You want things to work mechanically like they should. You don't want players feeling like they lost because of bullshit, right? And that's the biggest problem with a lot of these games, is that there are moments where it either feels like it's bullshit or it actually is mechanically bullshit where there's no real way out of it, right? But that's kind of a big problem with the whole camera conversation. Is sometimes it works fine, sometimes it doesn't. It's a little random sometimes, but certain bosses can get away with doing it where it can be a little annoying, or they sometimes won't have it happen at all. It really is kind of finicky.
Imagine rolling into a certain direction only for the entire angle of action to swap mid-button press, and you might get a good idea of why the lock-on breaks are done. I agree that they aren't the most elegant solution, but I think they are better than the alternative I just described. A better point in regards to lock-on is that boss fights should always lock on to the boss once the lock-on is triggered. Pressing the right analog stick is how you trigger the lock-on, but if there is no enemy for it to gravitate towards, then it simply centers the camera behind the player. That is a tactic no one has ever intended to use in the middle of a fight, and furthermore...
Sorry, I got distracted by his emote. I need to reset up that point that he's making. I got distracted by the make contact emote.
Boss once the lock-on is triggered. Pressing the right analog stick is how you trigger the lock-on, but if there is no enemy for it to gravitate towards, then it simply centers the camera behind the player. That is a tactic no one has ever intended to use in the middle of a fight, and furthermore, when the player is trying to get a lock-on during an encounter, boss or mob, if the game fails to register it and just centers the camera, it can be a death sentence. Centering the camera is a mechanic which I think these games would be wholly better off ditching.
I would actually disagree. I think centering of the camera is a simple matter of knowledge, like knowing the range of the particular lock-on of that fight, right? Now, granted, it should lock on no matter the distance, right? Slave Knight Gale is a good example of a really long distance lock-on position. But it is a thing where I do think that keeping it to where you can sort of auto center your camera, I think it's a good mechanic that you can use to your advantage. But it is a thing that it can create problems, but it can also be helpful in certain situations as well. I don't think it's a full positive or negative, kind of like he's saying where it's a full negative that we should remove. I think leaving it in is fine, but I think we should work on the lock-on distances for certain enemies, because sometimes the lock-on it takes way too little distance, right? Like some lock-ons don't work unless you're like 2 feet from the enemy, which is fucking pointless, right? Like you need to let the lock-on work right.
It's never useful and often lethal. Puritans might argue that this makes locking on more skill-intensive, but considering some of the quality of life improvements we've gotten from Software over the years, that argument seems like a non-starter to me. I don't think there's any good reason for this mechanic to be maintained. Going back to my point about separating unfairness and the feeling of unfairness, it seems like players intuitively expect the game to read the intent behind their actions, and that when it doesn't, players get upset. That's the feeling of unfairness. Genuine unfairness, however, is when you roll away from an attack but still get hit because the hitboxes were acting weird, or dying to poisoning mid-heal. Healing is not instant in these games, so even after you've triggered it, poison might still drain your health to 0 before you get the benefits. What stings especially hard about this is that even though you don't get the heal, the blood vials still often count as being used, so there's a disconnect which always comes out at the player's expense. But when it comes to fairness, players often neglect just how much the game is trying to benefit them. Anyone who thinks these games are unfair should consider what they would look like if they really intended on unfairness being the protocol. I'm currently fighting the Celestial Emissary, and once I'm done with him, the book on the choir is pretty much closed. After killing the emissary, we can sneak our way through a window, an Orlando style, to get underneath the altar of the Grand Cathedral. Down there, we get to the altar of despair and meet Ebrietas. The choir managed to obtain the Ease chalice, which allowed them to communicate with Ebrietas. And by studying the kin which littered Ease, the choir were able to dedicate their experiments. Mensis does not have access to a chalice, and so they cannot have audience with the Great One so easily. The whole idea of fear the old blood, our eyes are yet to open, was that using the old blood was dangerous because humans had not elevated their thoughts enough. The choir seemed to have understood that, and they agreed with Willem about this, but Lawrence thought he was ready, and we know what happened next. Menzies more so follows in the footsteps of Lawrence, except they seemingly don't even bother with the experimentations. They just go straight to the Great Ones and demand to be evolved. If we consider that the Willem-Lawrence ideological split is recurring in the choir and Menzies, then it should be no surprise that Menzies are making things horrible while the choir are basically becoming ineffective nothings which rot their brains trying to meditate too much. Where Willem watched the moon and searched for enlightenment, the choir make contact with the sky and hope to be granted enlightenment. The make contact gesture we got a few minutes ago can be used to get exactly one rune or a madman's knowledge if we already have the rune, and nothing else in the game, which I think is a bit of a missed opportunity. I wouldn't want any playthrough to require me to have to constantly stand stationary for as long as it takes me to perform the action, but I can also see that attaching more interactions to this gesture could have made for an easy way to deliver lore outside of item descriptions.
Here's one thing. Let's back that up a little bit, because there is one point I want to make here regarding what he's talking about.
To constantly stand rune gesture, hoped and search, meditate. Basically, logical split is recurring in the choir and Menzies, then it should be no surprise that Menzies are making things horrible while the choir are basically becoming ineffective nothings which rot their brains trying to meditate too much. Where Willem watched the moon and searched for enlightenment, the choir make contact with the sky and hope to be granted enlightenment. The make contact gesture we got a few minutes ago can be used to get exactly one rune or a madman's knowledge if we already have the rune, and nothing else in the game, which I think is a bit of a missed opportunity. I wouldn't want any playthrough to require me to have to constantly stand stationary for as long as it takes me to perform the action, but I can also see that attaching more interactions to this gesture could have made for an easy way to deliver lore outside of item descriptions.
Now, this is one thing that I think is sort of a down to sort of a personal thing is, having emotes do things that give you things, I think is something that the games do somewhat well with. In particular, I think Dark Souls 3 does a good uses emotes in a good way to deliver extra content, because in order to fight like the Nameless King, for example, and to get all the upgrades there and several of the items there that are very, very useful for upgrading weapons, you need an emote. You need an emote that you can use at a specific location in the Irithel dungeons that will take you to the Nameless King's area in Archdragon Peak, right? That is something that I think is a rather cool detail, that you can miss the area, and it's a thing where it's very subtle, which these games often try to be very subtle. They try to hint at what players can do, what they should do, for all these progression things. And we can kind of debate whether they do a good job or a bad job on a case-by-case basis. But I think the application of emotes that give you specific items or unlock different things, I think overall has been an interesting part of the series that I think is a positive. Now, not every instance is a good instance. Like, for example, I think that there are some that aren't particularly good. Like the make contact gesture, for example, you hit the emote and then you have to sit there and just kind of stare at the screen for a little while, and then you get the reward. Which can be similar to the Dark Souls 3 thing, but the difference is that you wait a couple seconds in Bloodborne for a rune or a Madman's Knowledge, or you wait a couple seconds in Dark Souls 3 and you get a whole nother area, upgrades, 2 bosses, and special items, and the end, and an important area for a quest line, right? There's a lot of content behind that emote, right? And the other games, I think, can take advantage of that if they do something similar. Now, I'm not saying the Bloodborne system is bad either. Like, you're not sitting there for 10 minutes, right? You're sitting there for, like, several seconds, And Dark Souls 1 did this in a similar way, too, where you crouch in the nest of the bird, so it takes you back to the asylum. You sit there for a little bit the first time, but on repeat tries, it goes a lot faster, right? So it's not something where you're sitting there for 2 minutes waiting for something to happen. On a case-by-case basis, they're usually consistently pretty good. They might demand a little patience from you, but they're not overwhelming. It's not like you have to sit in front of a doorway for 10 minutes to unlock an item, right? It's nothing ridiculous. It just requires a couple seconds of you sort of being patient, which is kind of a through line through these games, is pay attention, be patient, and strategize.
I already said that I like it when unconventional mechanics or clever uses of mechanics are used to handle narrative, and this meeting with Ebrietas was one such opportunity. Mensis not only did not have access to a third court, Murkos is in the nightmare, and they couldn't get there, but they also showed no regard whatsoever to Willem's warning. Mikolas assumes that Rom's vacuousness was due to her ignorance as a human, meaning he would have been aware that ascension had taken place. Therefore, it's easy to connect that he knows you need a cord for it. But instead of luring the Great Ones with the offering of children, Mensis conducted a mass sacrifice to bring on the Red Moon, and the rest of this story you already know. In closing out on the optional stuff in base game Bloodborne, our next heading will be Canehurst Castle. Purely in terms of fan love per mileage, this area might be the best From Software has ever done. What made it into the game is around half or so of what Canehurst was meant to be, and it's possible that at some point, in some build, Canehurst was actually meant to be a mandatory part of the game. The visual design of Bloodborne was influenced a lot by movies. The most important ones I figure being Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, The Brotherhood of the Wolf, and Jigoku. From Jigoku, we get some of the visual design of the fishing hamlet. From Brotherhood of the Wolf, we get clothing, some areas, and maybe the idea of an outsider coming into a place where a beast is a problem. And from Dracula, we get the fashionable and flowing clothes. We get the Mensis cage helmets, and we also get the Thumerian character design. Funnily enough, Canehurst, which is inspired by Dracula's castle, down to you getting an invitation by letter like Jonathan Harker in that story, and likewise being pulled to the castle by a carriage, might actually have more in common with the 2004 Hugh Jackman vehicle Van Helsing. Ever since it released, I've had a soft spot for it, and if you want to see the idea of a trench coat wearing monster hunter using trick weapons to confront werewolves, vampires, and other assorted gothic supernatural phenomena in movie form, then I'd recommend checking it out. It's not a masterpiece or anything, but it's a personal favorite. Without going into spoilers, the confrontation with Martyr Logarius is very reminiscent of the third act of that movie, where The main trio uncover a secret passage in a castle leading to the wintry final showdown. I consider Canehurst to be the ultimate culmination of the Bloodborne we were promised in the beginning. The game sets up aspirations of a gothic action RPG, and going off of that, players might naturally expect the final level to look something like what we get here. While I really like that Bloodborne takes the Eldritch twist, I am happy that we also get a payoff to the setup from all the way back. While the layout of the castle isn't the most involved the game has on offer, I like it all the same because I think it's a good narrative set piece. Instead of vampires, Canehurst was occupied by Vilebloods, who, much like the Yarnamites, are actually just like old aristocratic Thumerians, whose blood is less diluted as they've assumably been inbreeding or something. Going by some of the visual designs we see in the Chalice dungeons, there was seemingly a point where the Thumerians warred amongst each other, and the losing factions was driven to the surface. That faction would found Canehurst, as is evident by the corpses of the dead Thumerians wearing the fluted armor set, which we also see in the portraits here in Canehurst. The cultures we visit in Bloodborne are all very matriarchal, and it probably has to do with the interactions people have with the Great Ones. Thumerian women are able to carry the children of the Great Ones. The children are all stillborn, but this is seminal enough of an encounter that it organizes the entire civilizations around the women who can carry these children. So, although the Canehurst sect and the would-become Yarnam sect diverged, both wind up being matriarchal because that's the mold which best congeals with the reality they find themselves in. They pick for themselves queens who will carry the offspring of great ones. I repeat that point because it'll be relevant again soon. The contemporary story of Canehurst almost reads like a copy of the story in Yarnam. When Lawrence was experimenting with old blood, he ditched his fellows in Bergenworth and came to Canehurst. The Vilebloods all appear much closer to the Thumerians than the Yarnamites did, and that's because Lawrence reintroducing them to the old blood reawoke the latent Thumerian traits in them again. We can see portraits of a man who has eerily circumstantial apparel linking him to Lawrence on the wall, so his association with the Canehurst nobles, by all accounts, seems to have been in good spirits. He liked them, they liked him. Or, more specifically, they liked the blood he brought them. And when Canehurst had their own version of the Plague of the Beasts, well, they just sent their knights to work dealing with them. As for Lawrence, the blood kept flowing. That is, until things started falling apart back in Yarnam, and Lawrence realized he needed help from a great one lest Yarnam be destroyed by the beasts. Lawrence spread the word that the blood in Canehurst was forbidden, and that it threatened the purity of the Yarnam blood. Then, Lawrence got the executioners to siege Canehurst and slaughter everyone there they could. Some Vilebloods escaped by hiding in Yarnam, but as is made evident by the number of corpses and ghosts in Canehurst, this was a bloodbath.
There's one thing is I kind of want to mention now, just involving Canehurst. The area has the biggest character arc for me as like a whole area, because this is totally unrelated to what he's saying, but I want to get this out kind of now. Is the area progression of the way the encounters work and the way the enemies work, I think just goes, it has a huge character arc, in my opinion, where the outside, like, engorged blood enemies, I hate them. I really hate them. The ghosts on the inside, I think, are a lot more interesting and engaging and spooky because they don't really appear until you're close. And then I really like the way these little gargoyle-esque enemies kind of hang around here. And I really enjoy the Martyr Logarius fight. Like, I really enjoy that fight. And it's so weird for me to have that experience. Like, I don't really think there's any other area in a From Software game where I've had that experience where the intro enemies I hate, then things get better, then they caps off with a good boss. I don't think I've ever had that experience in any other games of them, and I think that is something worth mentioning about Canehurst. I think Canehurst as an entire package is really interesting, just as a locked off sort of castle. That it's got a good mix of elements in it that I think make it interesting, as well as the gradual progression of more interesting and better content as you sort of go through the area. But I kind of just want to throw that out there just because we're here.
And from Queen Annalise, Lawrence got a dead infant Great One, which he used to lure the moon presents. You know this story. Miyazaki likes to cannibalize his work a lot, so old ideas which he couldn't get working in one game or in one build tend to show up in subsequent ones.
Dark Souls 3 seems to have originally been
The story of the end of the world and how fire's numerous resurrections had destroyed it. If Elden Ring turns out to be the story of people turning to ash because the law of the world had been broken, if it includes a woman who upgrades your levels, phenomena in the sky which fundamentally alter the world state at some point, and if it includes strange marriages or contracts between godlike beings and humans, and if there's an area where stagnant water houses some sort of filthy creature, don't call me a prophet, call me a man who sees trends.
Okay, I kind of agree with. But if none of this shows up in Elden Ring, I'm going to delete this video to cover my shame. You should be shameful for other things that you missed in this video, man. I mean, you're just pointing out things that Miyazaki likes doing. That's really it. But I want to go back to that Dark Souls 3 point because that sounded kind of weird.
Working in one game or in one build tend to show up in subsequent ones.
Dark Souls 3 seems to have originally been
The story of the end of the world and how fire's numerous resurrections had destroyed it.
Why does he say seems? Why does he makes it he the way he speaks of it makes it seem like that was the original idea when that's what Dark Souls 3 is. That's why the ending with Gale is so poignant at the end of the game. It's because the society has been set up to burn people and burn Lords of Cinder over and over and over to keep the flame going, right? Even though it totally shouldn't because it's destroying the world. And when you get to Gale at the end of Dark Souls 3, at the end of the last DLC, that's why the world is covered in ash. It's because everything's been burnt. There's nothing left, right? That's the whole fucking point of the game. Why does he make it sound like that's not the point of the game? It's like, whether that's the original point or not, that's what the point of the game is. That's what the point of the narrative is. By that point, is that the world has been burnt and there's nothing left to burn. It's really weird. He makes really odd points about certain things in these games from time to time, which can be interesting, and then he blatantly misses major aspects of other games. And it's really just odd.
If Elden Ring turns out to be the story mentally or contract, water houses some sort of filthy creature,
I've already heard this.
don't call me a prophet, call me a man who sees trends. I theorized that the sun in Anor Londo was supposed to be much bigger of a feature in that game, and that it was originally supposed to be reintroduced here with the Red Moon. But the impact of the Red Moon was so massively reduced in this game that Dark Souls 3 tried to reintroduce it by having an eclipse happen at one point, which was supposed to be when the Age of Fire canonically ended, prior to that game getting rewritten.
So is that what he meant? Is that the thing that he? Because has he played the DLC of Dark Souls 3? Because while I can admit that the base game doesn't necessarily deal with the end of time, it is heavily hinting that we are reaching the end times, right? And the end of the Ring City DLC absolutely confirms that the Dark Souls world is toast, right? I mean, for lack of a better word, it was literally toasted. But I mean, I need to hear that again because I don't quite get where he's going with this.
By having an eclipse happen at one point, which was supposed to be when the Age of Fire canonically ended, prior to that game getting rewritten. Sekiro's entire plot seems to have been cobbled together from Bloodborne's leftovers, down to the whole story being propelled by a mysterious disease, having corpses animated by insects, imposter Yosefka being remixed for Dojun, and the sculptor having been amputated, which seems to be a carryover idea from Bloodborne, where Gurman is missing a leg. The sculptor was amputated to stop Shura from awakening within him. Gurman was amputated because beasthood travels up the right leg. I'm not saying Miyazaki lacks creativity, though. Quite the opposite. He often has too many ideas, and because these games are iterated on as they are designed, to the extent that they are not as internally consistent under the microscope as they might otherwise have been, and they also tend to each include iterations on themes which the last game didn't fully deliver on.
I mean, I kind of see where he's coming from with that, but I think the biggest thing is just that Miyazaki doesn't seem to have, or at least he doesn't during the kind of earlier stages of the games, is that he seems to have an exorbitantly ambitious vision that never seems to get fully realized. That's something that I've gotten from people talking about the behind the scenes things with different ideas that are developed in different games. You know, and it's a thing that I feel like it's a thing where he just never had either the right control, the right budget, the right time frame, or a mixture of all three, which I feel like he has now after the massive success of Elden Ring, him taking over from Software, and the sales of Elden Ring doing phenomenal, right? I think he's in a position to make the most Miyazaki of Miyazaki games, for lack of a better phrase. But it also is a thing where like game development is very slow, so redoing things and reformatting things and revising things is a very, very common thing, especially when you're on a budget and you're on a time frame to get something out there. So, I mean, I think it does really come down to delivering on the product as best you can. But there are inevitably going to be corners that are cut for X, Y, or Z reason.
I'm not making any predictions on Elden Ring here. I'm just noting how these games are made. And it's not exclusive to cut content. I've already noted how many of the NPCs in Bloodborne are brought over fairly unchanged from Dark Souls, which brought them over fairly unchanged from Demon Souls. But Canehurst itself might be FromSoft's heist of the century. The ghosts in this area are pretty much carbon copies of the ones from Dark Souls' New Londo. Right.
What the hell was that? Did you guys hear that? Like the inner demon came out of Acer for a minute.
Are pretty much carbon copies of the ones from Dark Souls' New Londo. Right.
That's disregard the point about in Orlando ghosts and things. That's just funny. It's just a funny audio glitch.
Are pretty much carbon heist of the century. The ghosts in this area are pretty much carbon copies of the ones from Dark Souls' New Londo, right down to their behaviors.
Except that the ones in New Londo fly. That's a major difference. It's a pretty fucking major difference. Especially because they can phase through shit and fly. So they can attack you from many different angles, and they float, and they require specific items to be able to kill them. They're actually quite different. Aesthetically, they may be similar, but they are still quite different.
Some come at the player with knives, some scream in the player's presence and lure the other ones to them. Also, New Londo in Dark Souls.
Wow, he mentions two things that they have in common. And then they're the same, carbon copies. So I guess Bloodborne's a carbon copy of Dark Souls because it has more than one weapon you can use to fight enemies.
Some come at the player with knives, some scream in the player's presence and lure the other ones to them. Also, New Londo in Dark Souls connected to the Valley of the Drakes, so if Miyazaki was playing through that area when he was getting ideas for this place, I imagine that the lost children of antiquity, the gargoyle enemies here, might have been pilfered from the Drakes in Dark Souls' Valley.
What? Okay, he's really starting to losing me. He's really starting to lose me, and he's losing me fast. Like, what the fuck do the drakes have to do with the gargoyles here?
Place, I imagine that the lost children of antiquity, the gargoyle enemies here, might have been pilfered from the drakes in Dark Souls' Valley. All this area would need to click into place would be an enemy reminiscent of New Londo's Dark Wraiths, but it seems like the better angels of Miyazaki's nature got to him in time.
What the hell was he talking about with that? I know I'm laboring on a point that's really minor here, but I got to figure out what the fuck he's talking about regarding this gargoyle drake comparison. It's like the ghost comparison. Like, you could kind of see some aspects of it in terms of how they mechanically work, but there are still way more differences than similarities. But I am just confused on this drake versus gargoyle thing. This is just weird.
Drakes. So if Miyazaki was playing through that area when he was getting ideas for this place, I imagine that the lost children there's presence and lure the other ones to them. Also, New Londo in Dark Souls connected to the Valley of the Drakes. So if Miyazaki was playing through that area when he was getting ideas for this place, I imagine that the lost children of antiquity, the gargoyle enemies here, might have been pilfered from the Drakes in Dark Souls' Valley. All this area would need to click into place.
So he's drawing a comparison between them, saying that Miyazaki pilfered the idea from the Drakes in the Valley of Drakes because the Valley of Drakes connects to New Londo. What? What? I just gotta.
What? What the fuck?
Like, what? Like, what kind of point is that? Like, I can understand like having an idea that's somewhat similar, either in terms of the aesthetic or something that might mechanically have similar functionality, but like the gargoyles are inspired by the drakes because the ghosts inspired the Canehurst ghost people here. That seems like such an asinine stretch, right? And I'm not trying to be rude by it when I say asinine, but it just seems like such a radical stretch of a point to like draw a connection there when it could just be as simple as gargoyles are thematically connected with old creepy castles and old creepy structures. So throw them in because we can make a unique enemy here. Right. Like, this comes back to a point I made in a previous stream where I said some things in these games are not actually that deep, right? Sometimes things don't have to be that deep, right? Sometimes it might just be, this is a cool idea because aesthetically it matches with what they're going for, right? It may not be any deeper than that. And wow, just this Canehurst section is just strange. It's just strange with some of the comparisons he's making.
Place would be an enemy reminiscent of New Londo's Dark Wraiths, but it seems like the better angels of Miyazaki's nature got to him in time. Jokes aside, though, I really like it when this sort of remixing is done right, and I think it really works for what Canehurst is going for. Ghosts might not be the most original solution to how to fill an area which is supposedly empty with challenging enemy encounters, but they get the job done. The ghosts here are docile until you start to loot their stuff, so anything they deal out to me on my go-through here I well and truly deserve. The reason I'm pillaging this place, knowing I'm just making it harder for myself, is because the Canehurst loot sells for a good amount of blood echoes, and I wanted to hedge for the boss ahead. If Logarius proved to be too difficult, I wanted to have something to sell to get a couple of levels, considering I was about 20 levels lower in this run than in the test run I did when I mapped this whole video out. Luckily for me, the level design is helping to make my robbery go smoother. Canehurst is a very interior-heavy area, so it's one of the best examples of the restraints which the combat placed on the level designers.
To make the game tolerable to play, areas are much wider than they were in Souls, and the camera is better at not getting snagged on the general clutter in levels.
Hold on, let's go back to what he just said there with the wider areas again.
Combat placed on the level designers. To make the game tolerable to play, areas are much wider than they were in Souls, and the camera is better at not getting snagged on the general clutter in levels.
I mean, I would say these maps are pretty similar to a lot of Souls maps. I mean, granted, I think Bloodborne does make some arenas for fighting bigger, but most of the time, the only reason they are bigger is because of the boss being bigger physically. You know, like the one Reborn is a good example. It's like, well, that's a good example, and as well as like Amygdala, right? Like those arenas are fairly big because you're fighting a big enemy. It's not necessarily that they made the area bigger overall. It's because they made an area that's appropriate for the enemy and the size of the enemy, right? It's not, and also it's like this game didn't change the areas up drastically to make the combat better or to make the overall experience better. They just made areas and tried to make the enemy encounters appropriate given the area, because it's a lot easier to copy and paste enemies than it is to copy and paste levels, right? Especially when you do the From Software thing where you link things together logically in the world.
Additionally, the camera feels like it's better at giving you the angle you want because, I repeat myself, it's not as bad as the Dark Souls and Demon Souls cameras were getting snagged on stuff.
I mean, it might also help that this is a new engine, right? This is not the same engine as Dark Souls 1 and 2. Like, things have clearly been changed, and they've clearly had a hardware upgrade, right? Like, Dark Souls 1, Demon Souls, first iteration of Dark Souls 2, all of those games were running on, like, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 level technology, right? When you have the upgrade to a PlayStation 4, Xbox One, like, level of tech, the engine will also get an upgrade, typically. So the game will usually run smoother, work better, and look better, right? That's just a common factor in video games. They tend to improve with each generation. Things become more complicated. Things become more in-depth. Things become able to handle, things are able to be done that couldn't be done before because the system can handle it, and they can handle the processing power, and the developers can do more with the new technology, you know, in kind of symbiosis with the games they're making, right? This isn't, this isn't Bloodborne being revolutionary. This is Bloodborne being in the right place at the right time to get a technical upgrade.
What makes Miyazaki's devotion to every now and then include weird platforming challenges in his games interesting is not only that the movement in his games at this point was incredibly primitive with no real mechanics devoted to interacting with the environment, such as mid-air jumps or let's grabs, but also that the presentation format is going against him. I've had this theory for a while that the industry-wide shift from platformers towards action games as the de facto model for what a video game should be didn't just occur because players got older and wanted more quote-unquote mature games, and because consoles got powerful enough to render some enemies, but also that it happened because the display standards were changed. The worldwide adoption of the more cinematic widescreen over the formerly standardized and more intimate 4:3 aspect ratio.
Okay, this is where he's using flowery language to make his point, and he betrays his bias, because there's nothing more intimate about having a 4:3 aspect ratio compared to a widescreen. Okay, it's just a difference in how the fucking thing looks. There's no intimacy in the classic style just because it's a older style, right? This is one thing that annoys the piss out of me whenever content creators draw comparisons, is that they use all this flowery, fluffy language to make their point seem better when at the baseline of it, you just have a difference in presentation. That is it. There's no difference apart from pixel number and the shape of the screen, right? And the reason I'm going kind of hard on this point is because, his point about platformers kind of getting replaced with action games is, I feel like he's going to make a point that I'm going to heavily disagree with, because if you were to ask me why I think platformers kind of went to the wayside and people jumped onto action games more often, I would say it's because you can do a lot more with action than you can with platforming, right? And that's not an insult to platforming. It's like there's only so much you can do with platforming before you start to repeat yourself. Whereas action, there are all kinds of actions that you can do. There's all types of action that you can do. And then one thing too is the cinematic quality of a game does impact how the game plays. Because if you play a game that looks and is shot like a professional grade A action scene of a movie, that can be incredibly engaging. I'm not saying that you have to do that, but it can be incredibly helpful for the atmosphere if you try to make it cinematic. Now, obviously, I don't want something like what I've heard happens a lot in the Metal Gear Solid series, where from what I heard, Gear Solid 4 was basically half cutscene, right? Which for a story-heavy game like that, we can argue if it's appropriate or not. But having too many cutscenes can bog down the experience when you want to play the game, right? But this is one thing that I'm kind of bringing up now because I feel like he's about to bring up something regarding the comparison between old platforms and old systems versus newer action games and newer systems. And I feel like he's going to give a really biased explanation of what the difference is between the two. And I feel that's going to really hinder me from believing his argument when he kind of sets it up as portraying his sort of bias. But anyway, let's try to get this full point.
That it happened because the display standards were changed. The worldwide adoption of the more cinematic widescreen over the formerly standardized and more intimate 4:3 aspect ratio meant that the camera in video games was better at showing the player their immediate environment than it was at presenting elevation. 4:3 was the initial format because film stock is naturally in the 4:3 aspect ratio. Widescreen came about when cinema attendance began dropping in the advent of home televisions, as Hollywood wanted to differentiate movies from TV shows. Games may have had their first life in the arcades, but console games were designed
around the display parameters of television,
not cinema, which meant 4:3, which I theorized to have given platformers the edge over action games. Combat usually happens on flatter terrain than platformers do, and the display shakeup from 4:3 to widescreen might have artificially capped platformers' ability to fully utilize the camera, just like how the original 4:3 aspect ratio capped action games' ability to fully utilize the camera.
What? Dude, is the one thing is you're not capping something with the shape of the screen, right? That you're not capping anything. That doesn't come down to screen shape. It comes down to how the developers use the common screen shape at the time, right? You can take any platformer that's on a 4:3, put it into a generic widescreen, and then if you zoom out, you've effectively fixed the problem, right? Of having a quote unquote smaller screen or a quote unquote bigger screen, right? Just zoom in or zoom out. Boom, you fixed the fucking problem. You fixed the difference, right? If anything, I'd say widescreen is better for platformers because you have a longer range to look from left to right as opposed to the 4:3, right? Or if the developers are really lazy, they build it in a 4:3 and then just scrunch the top and bottom off and make it work like that. I mean, either way, it feels like he's drawing a comparison to other mediums that don't really have the significant impact when you think about it just on a basic logic level. It's like, what's the point of changing aspect ratios, for games when you just create, video games did not create the aspect ratio, right? The aspect ratio changed just because they created a different aspect ratio, right? I don't know much about the history of Hollywood in terms of the changing of the way that films are shot and stuff like that in terms of the actual aspect ratio used. But I don't think that affected games as much as he's making it out to be. I think he's just drawing a comparison because he wanted to talk about it. And it feels like a headcanon reason for why platformers have kind of fallen out of vogue overall as sort of the dominant like game type. When I think it's really as simple as you can do more with action games and you can have platforming in action games. So why would people go to a strictly platformer game, right? Or a platformer game that's very limited based on the medium it's in, right? Like nothing against platformer games, but if you were to give me a 3D action game that has platforming in it, Doom Eternal is a good example of one that has platforming featured as a major part of the mechanics of playing that game. Compare that to a side-scrolling 2D game that has action and almost said parkour, but like compare like a side-scrolling action platforming game, and then compare Doom Eternal to that by the same sort of like mechanical limitations, right? Doom Eternal can do way more because it's 3D, because you can platform, up, down, left, and right, but you can also go side to side. You can go in a circle. You can do things in a 3D realm that you cannot do in a 2D realm, right? And a lot of action games, are built into the 3D realm, whereas a lot of platformers are traditionally built in the 2D realm. I don't think that's a very big stretch to say that. I mean, when you look at platformers, a lot of them are 2D, right? I would probably say that more platformers are in the 2D space compared to most action games being in the 2D space, right? And I think it's in reverse for action because, as graphics get better, action should get better because now you can see more. You can see things in 3D. Now you can see things not in 3D, but in 3 dimensions, right? It's not a 2D thing scrolling left and right anymore, right? The technology has gotten better, so action games have come up because they're usually easy to impress with because you can do things graphically with 3D assets that you don't get the same effect with when you use 2D assets, right? And this is the thing that if you want to talk about like aspect ratio, like that should be a footnote compared to graphical content in relation to how these different mediums of video games function. But anyway, let's get through this random rant he's going through.
It's possible, of course, to place artificial bars on each side of the screen to simulate older aspect ratios, but that's not intuitive. And because the widescreen format gives unnecessary attention to the player's sights, that's where the player's eye for environmental awareness will be drawn rather than to higher elevations. If you're a designer playtesting a game you're making in widescreen, you might get drawn to the sights and might begin to wonder how to make use of that space rather than block it out to better service the platforming. Assuming you're making a platformer in the first place.
Again, this is that point is widescreen, I mean, truly any screen type would work, but widescreen is advantageous because if it's wider, you can put a bunch of information on the sides of the screen while still leaving the center of the screen open for stuff you need to see while playing the game, right? And this is one thing that you can do in both mediums, but it's also a point that should be mentioned is that video games are not the ones dictating the aspect ratio. The technology of how we view media is the thing that dictates aspect ratio, right? Like he mentioned, we had TVs, that were in 4:3, and then if assuming what he's saying about film is correct, they changed the aspect ratio to look different, right? So then cinema became that, and then our televisions became that, and then fucking everything became that, right? It's like video games don't really have a say in this because they're a visual medium that requires technology that has already been developed, widely spread, and it's all in this sort of aspect ratio, right? It's not that the design of these things is drastically affected. It's just they're trying to just fit the fucking screens we have. I mean, I think it's as simple as that, right? They're just trying to make the game fit on the screen that you are using to watch the game play, right? I mean, it's also a thing too where I think having universal aspect ratios is way better than having a whole bunch of different ones, because then it means that we can all see the same shit in the same format on the same size of screen, right? We don't have to tweak it and change it and stretch it and do all this weird shit that a lot of people want to do nowadays. You know, it's like just play it in the medium that is the most common aspect ratio for people to see shit through.
If I'm right, and that's the natural impulse, game developers might have just accidentally felt they needed to have something of significance for the side view to impart to the player, and so might have been enticed to add some enemies around.
To get an idea of what I'm saying,
Imagine if Bloodborne's horizontal display area was capped, and you had to design a game out of this. Does this look like a game where you have the player maneuver elegantly through open areas to fight hordes of enemies, or does this more intimate presentation maybe make you expect a game that is more claustrophobic in nature?
I would like to add a caveat to this. Does this perspective also inform your decisions for how you play a game because you're used to the previous aspect ratio that is normal, that is the standard? All right, this is one thing he's missing when he's bringing up this comparison, is he's comparing the aspect ratios of much older games that were normal but aren't normal anymore, and he's putting a game into an old aspect ratio that would totally work in that aspect ratio. Right? Like, the aspect ratio are just the aspect ratios because the machines that we experience the visual medium through are a different shape, right? That's the only real reason that this shit is a different looking aspect ratio. It's because the screens are built differently. They have a different shape. That's all it is, Acer. It's not this massive hoopla about games trying to find out how they want to fucking present themselves. It's like you can take anything in like, as long as the aspect ratio is a reasonable rectangle or square, you're good. Hell, even a circle would fucking work. Octagon would be great, right? A trapezoid would be kind of weird, but you can make it work, right? As long as it's a general like blob where there's enough space in the middle where you can have information and accurately display what you want the player to see, you can make it work, right? This is just such a weird point he's like making with all this aspect ratio shit. It's like, why can't you talk about Canehurst while we're doing this? It's like you're talking about random shit when you could be talking about stuff that happens in Canehurst. It's just weird.
Enemies, or does this more intimate presentation maybe make you expect a game that is more claustrophobic in nature? Does this Bloodborne still look like an action RPG? Or does it maybe look more like a survival horror game?
I'd like to point out there are plenty of survival horror games that do not have this aspect ratio as well. This is the thing about some sections of this video is he brings in these weird talking points where he's just making shit up to fit an argument that we don't have to have in the first place, right? Like, what does it actually matter if the aspect ratio of a game is a 4:3 or the traditional widescreen? Like, what is actually affected? How much you see on screen? Yeah, but by how much? Not a lot. Like, you miss the sides, right? And you can't see as much. But if developers want you to see more, they'll just zoom the camera out more, right? Like, this is not what he's making it out to be. Like, he's reading into this so much about this aspect ratio thing, and it's just like, dude, it's just the format of visuals that we had at one point, and now we've switched over to widescreen. That's it. There's no greater philosophical debate to have. It's just we change the way we shape our entertainment. That's it.
I know how it makes me feel, but I'm genuinely interested in hearing people's thoughts on this theory of mine. It's interesting to think about how much the presentation can impact design, but Since I'm fighting Martyr Logarius, I'm going to stop this widescreen talk because I need all of the visual information I can get. The Martyr Logarius boss is a controversial one because he employs so many of the tricks which players are sick of. I noted some earlier when we discussed unfairness versus the feeling of unfairness, but the whole breakdown of Logarius goes, he's able to break your lock-on, he can get to elevations to do plunge attacks at you faster than you can track him in the air manually. His attacks try to trigger the player's reaction too fast by lying with their anticipation frames here and there. He has ways of reaching the player at every distance, so there's never any downtime. And finally, he's so aggressive that the player kinda needs to swap over to their faster weapon variant. All of this cumulative tack he employs makes him come across as immensely unfair, but individually, I don't think any of this is too much for a boss to have. If I have an issue with the way Logarius is designed, it's that the cumulative effects of all of his moves makes him break the player's expectations of the core combat. That is to say, Bloodborne is a game where you position yourself and the enemies. And Logarius is the only encounter where that is not the case. He, seemingly, alone has more mobility than you do. And so the framework you should bring into this fight, that is to be responsive, is not the same as you have going in any other part of the game.
I mean, this is one thing is like I actually really like the Martyr Logarius fight. I think it's actually a good mix of different things to keep you on your toes. You know, like none of these boss fights should be pushovers, right? You know, like and that's something that I think Martyr Logarius does well in spades is that he's got so many moves that counter shit that you're able to do, right? But given that, most of the time there's a telegraph, it's fair in its presentation, and you have time to react appropriately to it. You know, it's not like it's not like he has a move set that is undodgeable, right? Or move sets that are unpunishable, right? Like he's not overpowered. He just has a really varied move set that can catch a player out who's not playing on their A game.
So while Logarius is actually not that difficult, I do consider the game not prepping the player to have to change up their approach to movement to be poor game design. It's one thing for a boss to be executionally difficult, it's another thing entirely for a boss to be conceptually difficult. All throughout, you've been playing one sort of game, and just like my example of people asking a tool to do something it's not designed to, players get mad when the game is changed and they aren't told. They might be fighting well under the metal framework employed in the rest of the game, but since it's not applicable here and since players aren't told as much, they get upset pretty quickly. You can argue whether or not that's just how FromSoft makes Logarius a more satisfying boss to defeat, but you cannot pretend as if people's animus to this boss does not reflect poorly on the way it is set up. All that would really have been needed was for there to be a node or NPC outside the boss arena which said something like, Logarius was known for his mobility, even the greatest fighters were forced to follow his lead if they wanted to last in the ring with him.
I think that would actually radically cheapen any boss if you just left an NPC or a note outside saying, hey, by the way, this fucker's fast. It's like, because that's basically what you're telling the players. Like, hey, this guy's fast. It's like, okay, why are you telling me that? It's like, just let the boss tell me it when I fight it. This is one thing, too, is like, Logarius is a very unique boss in this game because he's basically the closest thing to a full-on magic build that you fight in the game. Right? Like, look at all the spells he's casted during this entire fight, right? Or spell-like things, right? It's not like he's ROM where he, like, shoots giant lasers at you. Or not lasers, but, like, shoots giant, like, meteors at you and just, like, explodes randomly. He shoots, like, homing missiles and little sword thingies. He's got a huge explosion. You know, he's got a lot of, like, magic shit on his side, which makes him very unique as a boss fight, but also very difficult because he's fighting with shit that is different from what you're used to. he's very unique in that sense. That's part of the appeal of the boss, in my opinion, is that he does fight in such a unique manner, and he's tough. Like I've found him to be a tough. Like he was the first boss in Bloodborne that I got stuck on for a while, right? But over time, I came to really appreciate like his boss design. Like I really like his movesets, varied. It is able to punish you at different distances. It keeps you on your toes, keeps you moving, and keeps you playing aggressively like Bloodborne wants you to do.
It said something like, Logarius was known for his mobility. Even the greatest fighters were forced to follow his lead if they wanted to last in the ring with him. Then, immediately, I think players would have appreciated the shakeup to mobility he brought. It just goes to show that communication is often the difference between fairness and the feeling of unfairness. Another example of bad communication in this boss is that, as you can see, in Phase 2, bullets bounce off of Logarius, but because your eye is so focused on him, you might not see the little bounce effects which they do. If you ever felt like you should have gotten a parry in but didn't, now you know why that might be. The crown we get after killing Logarius is likely a holdover item from when he was the king of Canehurst rather than its destroyer. Lore-wise, Canehurst is probably the messiest area in the game because it's where so many lore problems are stapled together. I already talked about how the executioners are an arm of the church. The misconception that they were foreign mercenaries came from the item description of the executioners' gauntlets, but there are things here which go much deeper than being misunderstandings in lore. There are things here which are genuinely baffling. Logarius, for example, is clearly a Thumerian. His visual design says as much, as does his weapon of choice. In the Chalice dungeons, we can fight the Elder Thumerians who utilize similar weapons as Logarius does, and how it came to be that he was the leader of the church's executioners is a bit of a head-scratcher. And Annalise is a whole bag of worms on her own. For starters, there is unused dialogue in the game for her where she is voiced by Eveta Muradasilova, who voices the doll. If you consider that this might have been a mandatory part of the game, and that Annalise's helmet is there to hide something that was meant to be a big reveal, that she was the real inspiration for the doll makes a lot of sense. The doll is taller than the player because she's based on a Thumerian woman. This would also explain the doll's attire, as it is very Canehurst-based, and this would also be how the Crow of Canehurst NPC would have connected to Gurman's old disciple, since it's clearly a hunter with a connection to Canehurst. In addition to recycling his old ideas, Miyazaki likes to use the same idea more than once in the same game. If you've ever wondered why Lawrence and Mikolash have the same background as old students of Willem, the same trajectory as defectors who created their own organizations, and have the same goal, it's because they were originally the same character. The model for Lawrence in the cutscene where he talks to Willem about the Bergenworth adage, that model is actually Mikolash.
Keep this in mind because it's a topic I'll be returning to later. The Vile Blood Covenant obligates players to search for blood tracks whose item description reads, "The vile bloods of Canehurst, bloodlusting hunters, see these frightful things in cold blood. They often appear in the blood of Echo Fiends, that is to say, the blood of hunters. Queen Annalise partakes in these blood dregs offerings so that she may one day bear the child of blood, the next vile blood heir." The idea that dregs appear in the blood of those who hunt might be that those who are tipped closer to blood drunkenness are going to have these things writhing inside of them, which might make their blood more potent. The Japanese name of the blood dregs is more like corrupted blood, and corruption is a big theme in the Vile Blood Covenant. The image of the blood dregs evokes sperm cells, and the idea of these things impregnating Annalise with a child of blood might connect somewhat to vermin. That Much like how vermin can form inside of a person organically, the madness of blood can give birth to a new life form, which Annalise is particularly suitable to carry, maybe because of the transformations she endured from consuming the old blood. If Annalise herself was born that way, it might be that this is how her peculiar type of immortality came to be.
Now that I have access to Annalise's throne room and the Altar of Despair, I'm going to finish out Alfred's questline. I like that this quest asks players to go to different places in the world. I know that things here just sort of fizzle out, but considering the competition, this is a pretty good Bloodborne quest, all things considered. The Hunter's Dream being the choke point of all warps means we have to contend with some loading screens, so I'll be editing this portion of the video to be a bit more palatable. And as much as I like having a hub like the Hunter's Dream, I'd be lying if I said that there weren't times where lantern-independent warping would be preferable.
I totally agree. Having to go back to the hub, even if you just want to teleport somewhere else, is really fucking stupid. It's really wasteful of time when we can totally do that. We were able to do that in the past. Dark Souls 2 did it. Dark Souls 1 did it. Why can't Bloodborne do it? This is new tech. New tech should be better, not worse. Why? Why?
The reason this stuff is all attached to the Hunter's Dream is because you are supposed to grow a mechanical dependency on and appreciation for it. That might be fine on paper, but in play it has some unfortunate knockbacks. Aside from the prolonged loading screens, because of the Hunter's Dream, the world map is broken up with every level up, and the extent to which it's mostly a seamless affair is not emphasized as much as the respectable job done here might merit. If players were as independent in Bloodborne as the bonfires in Dark Souls 1 made them in that game, I imagine that Bloodborne would have gotten more praise for its world design. I've talked about how I don't think it necessarily gels as well with the way Bloodborne tells stories as the world design in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1 did, but it's still mostly a respectable piece of tight level design all throughout. Something Alfred's quest showcases is the difference between what a quest can be and what a quest maybe should be. I'll talk more about this when we go into the DLC, but what I'm saying is, advancing Alfred's quest asks the player to change their approach to the game rather than the quest itself being conveniently mapped to how the player goes through the areas already. There is certainly some value in a quest like this, since it is a way for the game to get the player to revisit old areas, meaning some extra value can be squeezed from existing levels, but I wonder if those sorts of quests would maybe be better if they followed the model set by Eileen's, where the finale takes place in and out of the Grand Cathedral, with the player not having to warp around everywhere to complete it.
This is one thing that I think the NPC quest lines in these games do kind of suffer from sometimes, is the kind of like micromanagement of specific things you have to do to make the quest line work. And people are gonna be riled up because of me saying that, because it's like, it's a quest line, you're supposed to do shit during a quest line. That's how quest lines work. It's like, yeah, but sometimes the quest lines can be rather annoying when you have to do a bunch of shit and then warp around a whole bunch and talk to dudes like over and over and over, right? Like one quest line that I enjoy the content of but not the way it's handled is the Bloodborne guy in Dark Souls 3. I'm blanking on his name. Leonhard. Yeah. Like, his quest line is one of the ones that I think if you play the game appropriately, it's really fun. But doing it like after the fact, because he's one of the few quest lines that you can not do, right? Like, you do not have to talk to him at all when he first appears in Firelink Shrine. You can complete the fucking game and then go back to him, do all his quest line shit, and then you're done, right? Like, unless you've done a specific quest line beforehand, I believe it's Cirrus, you can just do his quest line whenever you've got all the areas unlocked, which on the one hand is kind of nice that it's not locked out like a lot of the other quests can be throughout these games. But it's really kind of annoying when you do all that and then you have to warp around a whole bunch and just kind of talk to him over and over. Like it's one of those things where I think returning to areas for quest lines is a good idea, but sometimes the implementation isn't as smooth as it could be. And that's something that I think From Software has kind of a mixed bag approach on. Like some quest lines are really good for keeping you engaged in the quest line because it takes you through new areas sort of as you reach them. The Henri quest line in Dark Souls 3 is a really good example of that. Every time you encounter Henri, you find him or her in a new place that you've just progressed to. So you're not repeating old ground over and over. You're constantly exploring and going along her journey. Or I'm going to say her just because I play a male character most of the time and she's female when I'm male, right? But the whole point I'm trying to make here is that, Henri is a good example of a quest that is actively pushing you forward, whereas other quests make you return to things and make you come back to places you've already been. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes that can get annoying when you want to do a quest line, but you have to go back to an area you've already gone through, and then you have to do that several times over.
Alfred used the summons I gave him to reach Annalise, and he's destroyed her. I'm currently taking her flesh to the altar of despair where she can be resurrected, so I should talk a bit about Ebrietas. Ebrietas is incorrectly labeled as daughter of the cosmos. The Great Ones cannot have children, so the insinuation that the cosmos bore her, which people in and out of this game like to connect with cause, is incorrect.
I mean, I always thought it was just more of a symbolic thing. Like, she's female and she is a result of the cosmos doing shit to her. I never thought it was like a direct, just, cause birthed her or whatever, or was her parent. I always viewed it as more of a metaphorical thing than an actual literal thing.
The Japanese name for her is Ebrietas Musume, which can be translated as daughter or as maiden, which is why the Rosmarinus description, the Rosmarinus being the signature weapon of the choir who found Ebrietas, why its description reads, a special weapon used by the choir, high-ranking members of the Healing Church.
Little little typo mistake there. That R should be slanted or italicized like the rest of the stuff. Or maybe that is italicized. I don't know. It looks off compared to the other letters.
Sprays a cloud of sacred mist created by using blood-imbued quicksilver bullets as a special medium. Arias are heard wherever sacred mist is seen, proving the mist is a heavenly blessing. O fair maiden, why is it that you weep? That fair maiden part is a reference to Ebrietas. Visually, Ebrietas might have been based on the description H.P. Lovecraft gives to Cthulhu. In the Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft describes it as a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. Alternatively, she has some similarities to the Pisakas from Dark Souls. As it relates to combat, visual design-wise, Ebrietas' greatest strength is that her numerous tentacles makes it a bit hard to read her animations, and because she is so big, it can be hard to dodge away from her when she starts her attacks, because most of the time you'll just zoom into another part of her body and get hit by the full brunt of what she throws out at you if you're not careful.
That's one of my biggest problems with Bloodborne, is when you have enemies like this that have big flaily limbs, they hog your camera, they're in your face, and you can't fucking see what they're doing. That's one of the biggest problems I have with Bloodborne, is that a lot of bosses run into this issue where you have this big flailing mass of tentacles or fur and blood splattering everywhere, and you can't make out what's going on, which makes them able to hit you, which feels massively unfair. It would be like if you were fighting, let's say, Artorias, and then he randomly exploded into a cloud of dust where you can't see him, and then he hits you. That's mechanically the same problem, right? And that's the reason that I don't like playing Bloodborne as much as the other games, is because the bosses are kind of bogged down by the Bloodborne camera problem, which is what I've coined, where basically happens what I just explained, which is the camera cannot zoom out enough to let you see their moveset, so you're just kind of fucked as they spaz around you. And that's something that really annoys me about Bloodborne's combat, especially regarding some bosses that I think are aesthetically really cool, but ultimately problematic because of the way the camera works around them.
I'm able to get some good hits on Ebrietas' head with my vertical overhead swing, but even that much isn't enough to drag me over the finish line in my first attempt at the fight, so I summoned an old friend. My defenses aren't high enough that I can afford to eat the blows from her as much as I do, so I'm wasting a lot of her attack recovery frames healing with vials rather than go in for the rally recovery. I also got hit by Ebrietas' charge attack, a big threat in this arena considering there's no pillar or rubble for the player to hide behind, and because Ebrietas can perform heavy-hitting arcane attacks which, if you aren't situated quite properly in the start of the attack, it can be really hard to dodge. I noted the ebb and flow of bosses way back, and Ebrietas is a boss I think is well designed for the correct levels. If I approached her less greedily, I would have ended up saving time on the run since I wouldn't have died like an idiot, but because I knew I could brute force my way through this, I did just that. It's interesting to think about, but if this boss would have been harder, or if the path towards her would have been, I probably would have had a much smoother go of it because I would not be making as many unnecessarily risky moves. I know that sounds like I'm coping from the obviously bad display on screen, but oftentimes, finesse is a question of patience more than anything else. You ultimately do need to decide when is a good time to deal damage. You can't just dodge the bosses and hope to make it through Silent Hill style. But because I'm not really having that hard of a time, and because it's not that difficult to get back here, taking every strike I'm offered is not as dumb as a strategy as it seems on paper. At least, it didn't feel so dumb in the moment. If I were underleveled for this encounter, I would have played it much safer, but because I knew I could eat the hits, I decided to just try and get it over with as fast as I could, rather than prolong it any further than I had to.
Even though he got rid of his summon before the fight was over, which I found to be kind of hilarious that he decided to do that when he wanted to get it over with. I really wonder why you would take out someone who's helping distract the boss and also helping to damage the boss when you want to end it quickly. That seems like you're trying to do one thing but presenting evidence to the contrary.
Plus, I already made Martyr Logarius look easy by eating so many hits to display that bullets bounce off of him, so I'm not too fussed about people thinking I'm bad at the game.
Wow, that was it. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to end this here. We've made some really good progress. How far did we get? We were roughly right there. So we made it about an hour through, which is nice. Maybe the next time we'll get through maybe all the DLC stuff. Maybe we'll actually get through all the DLC stuff by the end of the next stream. But this has been fun. Ranting about this is always enjoyable, especially when he just makes weird arguments and I have an opinion on them. But I'm going to continue slogging through this video as best I can. I'm really trying to get through this fucker. It has taken so damn long. This is part 7, right? So this has taken forever. I think we might end this by part 9-ish, hopefully. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm going to end this stream here, and I look forward to next Saturday when hopefully you can join. and be in the discussion for the DLC, because I know the DLC is going to be a big talking point based on the bosses, the lore, as well as the fact that a lot of people look very fondly upon this DLC. So we'll see how that goes when we get there. But for now, I'd just like to thank you guys for watching, and God bless.